Federal Agent Lena Watson faces a cop who refuses to acknowledge her authority and tries to use his power against her. A routine ID check turns into a standoff that attracts a crowd and becomes the beginning of a major scandal. When the situation escalates to the limit, people arrive on the scene who can turn the game around. But the question is, will justice really be on the side of justice? Don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss news stories. New York was waking up to its usual rhythm, the noise of cars, the endless honking of horns, the ringing of bicycle bells and human voices merging into a single stream of urban chaos. The air was saturated with the smell of morning coffee, escaping from small street cafes, and a mixture of gasoline and wet asphalt. Crowds of people hurried along the streets, each at their own pace, immersed in their own thoughts, in work, in routine. Among them, Lena Watson walked with confident steps. She took her time, allowing herself a rare moment of leisure, enjoying the cool air that filtered through the collar of her leather jacket. She wore dark jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and high boots, an outfit that was inconspicuous but comfortable for any occasion. She looked like an ordinary city dweller, but to those with an eye for detail, her upright posture and keen gaze betrayed someone accustomed to being in control. As she passed the shop windows, she couldn't help but catch a glimpse of herself. Tall, fit, with her dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail that accentuated her stern features. Her brown eyes followed the street carefully, not just mechanically scanning the space, but assessing her surroundings. This was a habit she had developed long ago, as part of her job, as a necessity to always be one step ahead. Lena worked as an FBI agent. It was her day off. A normal morning in the big city, a chance to forget for a moment about investigations, interrogations, crime reports. But New York didn't let her forget about reality. The sharp screech of brakes made her turn around instinctively. A police patrol car stopped abruptly at the curb and a tall man in uniform stepped out. "Hey, stay still!" A rough, commanding voice made Lena freeze for a moment. She turned slowly and her gaze met the cold, narrowed eyes of a middle-aged white police officer. Officer Bradley Kane. She immediately understood who she was dealing with. She had met this type of man more than once, too confident in his impunity, accustomed to commanding, looking down on, not allowing the thought that someone could question his words. He stepped out of the car, leaving the door open, and crossed his arms over his chest, looking at her as if he had caught a dangerous criminal. "What are you doing here?" Lena felt a familiar feeling of irritation growing inside her. "I'm walking," she answered calmly. Kane chuckled. "In this area?" She exhaled through her nose, maintaining her composure. "Do I need to live here to walk down the street?" There was a short pause. Kane's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze hardening. He was clearly not used to being answered in that tone. "Documents." "What?" "Documents and identification." Immediately. Lena took a deep breath. Several passers-by slowed their pace, listening to the conversation. Some exchanged wary glances. She knew what was going to happen now. "I've seen this hundreds of times." She slowly reached for her wallet and pulled it out, taking out her ID. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." She said this specifically and clearly, without taking her eyes off the policeman. Kane froze. He took her badge and turned it over in his hands, his jaw tensing. "This has to be a joke," he muttered. Lena crossed her arms over her chest. "You are making a big mistake, officer." Instead of realizing the situation, Kane just smirked contemptuously. "Do you really think I'll fall for this?" There was mockery in his voice, but a new light appeared in his eyes. He was starting to get angry. Lena already understood who she was dealing with. This wasn't just a police officer who made a mistake. This was a man who didn't tolerate being put in an awkward position. "The badge is real," she said firmly. "And now, if you'll excuse me, I have things to do." She reached out to take it back, but Kane suddenly pulled his hand back and stepped closer, invading her personal space. "I'm not finished with you yet." Lena felt the air around her become heavier. She knew this conversation was just beginning. Lena didn't look away as Kane took a step closer. She'd seen people like him dozens of times, people who thought they were above the rules because their badge gave them a sense of impunity. But the most dangerous thing was that he was absolutely certain he was right. "I need to see your documents," he repeated, his voice becoming harsher, more insistent. "I've already shown you my ID, officer," Lena said evenly, without moving. "Now show me something real. A driver's license, a passport." There was a soft chuckle from the crowd, followed by a low murmur. People around him began to slow down, and some were already holding phones in their hands, filming what was happening. Lena saw how this mechanism works. First an unreasonable demand, then an aggressive tone, and then, if the victim does not agree to comply, an escalation of the conflict, which always ends the same way: the weaker one gets handcuffed. But she was not weaker. "Officer, you have no reason to demand additional documents from me. The FBI ID is an official identification document that you are obliged to recognize." Kane's lips twitched, but not in embarrassment, in anger. He was not used to being contradicted, much less confidently and calmly. "And yet I want to make sure that you are not lying." Lena slowly reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and pulled out a leather wallet. She took out her driver's license and handed it to the policeman. Kane snatched them up, ran his eyes over them, and grinned. "Lena Watson. FBI, huh?" "Exactly. And what are you doing in this area, Agent?" He said the word with such sarcasm that someone in the crowd began to whisper louder. "Just walking. Like any other resident of this city." Kane snorted and handed her license back, but kept the FBI badge. "Do you understand that this seems suspicious to me?" Lena raised her eyebrows slightly. "What exactly do you find suspicious, officer?" "The fact that you, a woman who claims to work for the FBI, are just walking around this neighborhood." Her patience was beginning to wear thin. "Officer, do you realize that you are currently abusing your powers?" Kane tilted his head to the side, his grin widening. "I'm doing my job. Checking the identity of a person who seems suspicious to me." "Suspicious?" She took a step closer. "On what basis?" He hesitated for a second, but immediately pulled himself together. "I'm asking questions here." Lena clenched her jaw. "In that case, I demand an explanation as to why you detained me?" The crowd around them was now clearly watching them, with their cell phone cameras pointed directly at them. Kane knew the situation was getting out of control, but he wasn't going to back down. "I have the right to demand documents from you if I consider you suspicious." "On what basis?" A cheeky tone. He grinned. "This is not a basis for identity verification." Kane was about to say something, but someone from the crowd shouted, "Just let her go. It's obvious that she's not a criminal." Kane turned sharply towards the voice, then looked back at Lena. She saw that he was irritated. "You can go." She extended her hand. "Give me back my badge." But Kane didn't move. "I'm not finished yet." Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. And Lena realized that everything was just beginning. Lena Watson stood there, her gaze unwavering, but the tension building inside her. She knew this moment. She'd seen it in dozens of other situations, read about it in reports, encountered it on the street when other people had been in her shoes. Kane held her FBI badge in his hands as if it were a simple trinket, a toy, not worth attention. "I'm not finished yet," he repeated, clenching his fist on the metal plate as if deciding whether to return it at all. The crowd around was thickening. People were no longer just watching, now it was open attention. A silent protest against what was happening. Someone was already recording video, and some were whispering among themselves. "Officer, I'm not asking, I'm demanding that you give me back my badge," Lena said evenly. But he didn't even blink. "Calm down, you're being too aggressive." She barely restrained herself from smiling. "Aggressively? I stand before you, not raising my voice, not making a single threatening move." "How exactly did you define my aggression?" Kane chuckled, tilting his head to the side. "Too many words, too much cleverness." His fingers slowly twirled her badge, then he abruptly threw it into her palm. "Okay, here you go." She caught it in midair, instantly shoving it back into the inside pocket of her jacket. But Kane did not back down. He suddenly stepped closer, so close that Lena could smell cheap coffee and menthol gum. No. His voice became lower, colder. Put your hands on your head. The crowd around suddenly froze. Someone gasped. Are you serious? Lena didn't move from her spot. Absolutely. He crossed his arms, clearly enjoying the situation. On what basis? I have the right to detain anyone who behaves suspiciously. Lena took a short breath. You're detaining a federal agent. Without cause. There is a reason. You make me suspicious. Her fingers involuntarily clenched into a fist. She knew Kane was playing a dangerous game. He wanted to show his strength. Wanted her to obey. So that she would kneel before him, so that those around her would see who was in charge here. Officer, she said calmly, but her voice was steely. You are now crossing the line into abuse of power. His grin grew even wider. And what will you do to me? He took another step, deliberately hovering over her. I said, hands behind your head. And if I refuse? He reached for his holster. Then I will use force. Voices of protest were heard from the crowd. Are you crazy? She didn't do anything. This is the FBI, do you understand what you're doing? But Kane heard nothing more. He has already made his decision. His fingers settled on the handle of the pistol. Lena didn't make a single move. A calculation was working in her head. She knew that every move she made now could be used against her. She knew that if she raised her hands, he would still use force. She knew that if she submitted, he would feel absolute power. And I knew that this moment was the boiling point. Lena looked him straight in the eyes. You don't understand the situation you've gotten yourself into, officer. Oh, come on. His fingers began to slowly draw out the weapon. And at that moment the roar of engines cut through the air. 3 black SUVs sped down the street, squeezing the space between cars. The city lights were reflected on their windshields. Kane's eyes twitched to the side. Lena took a short breath, her heart beating faster. The crowd turned around. Wheels screeched on the asphalt as the cars braked sharply just a few meters away. The doors swung open at the same time. People got out of the SUVs. They moved confidently, their steps firm on the concrete. Dressed in formal suits, with impassive faces. Lena knew these people. They were from the FBI's Homeland Security Division. And they came for Kane. It all happened in a matter of seconds. The black SUVs pulled up to the curb, the doors swung open, and 3 men and 1 woman in suits stepped out. Their confident, quick steps left no doubt that they knew what they were doing. Kane instinctively took his hand away from the gun, but his posture remained tense. He wasn't used to being interrupted, much less put in his place. The crowd fell silent. People who had been looking at what was happening with bewilderment just a second ago now froze in anticipation. A heavy pause hung in the air. Lena, without moving, turned her gaze to the tall man with hard features, who stepped forward first. Agent Watson. His voice was firm, but there was a note of concern in it. Are you okay? Kane blinked. Lena didn't answer right away, letting the officer feel the full depth of his mistake. She slowly turned her gaze to him, and saw how his self-confidence began to melt. Everything is under control, she finally said, not taking her eyes off Kane. The head of the Homeland Security Department, David Cross, raised his eyebrows slightly. Judging by the video that has already spread across social networks, something more serious happened here. Kane turned sharply to the crowd, and only then noticed how many people had their phones at the ready. Some were still taking notes, some were typing into social media. Lena saw something click in his head. He realized that control was no longer in his hands. What's going on here? Cross asked sharply, his gaze fixed on the policeman. Kane tried to regain his confidence. I was doing my job, checking documents. Cross nodded slowly. Did you check the documents with the federal agent? Kane hesitated, but immediately straightened his back. I found her behavior suspicious. What exactly made you wary? Kane clenched his jaw. Lena tilted her head slightly, waiting for an answer. He remained silent. Officer, Cross continued, his voice turning icy, are you familiar with Section 242 of Title 18 of the United States Code? Kane frowned. About abuse of office? Exactly. Cross nodded. It's a federal crime. Kane clenched his fists, but no longer looked Lena in the eyes. I didn't commit a crime. Then explain why you didn't recognize the FBI ID and why you reached for the weapon. Kane opened his mouth sharply, but couldn't find anything to say. Cross looked at one of his men. Find his personal file in the database. The agent quickly pulled out his tablet and slid his finger across the screen. Officer Bradley Kane, 12 years on the force. 9 formal complaints for abuse of power. 3 suspensions. 1 open investigation for false arrest less than 6 months ago. The crowd began to whisper. Lena watched Kane closely. Now he looked different. No longer the cocky officer who thought he was untouchable, he now knew it was the end. It's all nonsense, he said sharply, waving his hand. Some complaints that never came to anything. Cross crossed his arms over his chest. Perhaps you were able to evade responsibility before. But now everything has changed. Kane looked back at the crowd, then at Lena, then back at Cross. You have no right to detain me. Cross nodded slightly to his men. In that case, we will simply suspend you pending an internal investigation. This is a mistake, Kane barked. Officer Kane. Cross's voice was cold. Surrender your weapon and badge. The click of the holster's clasp sounded louder than the noise of the city. The crowd held its breath. Kane didn't move for a few seconds, but then slowly pulled out his pistol, unloaded it, and handed it to the agent. Then he took off his badge and, hesitating, threw it into Cross's hand. The crowd began to buzz. Lena saw someone smiling, someone clapping, and someone simply filming the last seconds of Kane's career. You don't understand what you're doing, Kane said through gritted teeth, looking at Cross. He just smiled coldly. No, officer, it was you who didn't understand. Kane took one last look at Lena. But now there was no longer contempt in his eyes. Only fear. She watched silently as 2 agents took him by the elbows and led him to the car. As the door closed and the SUVs drove away, the crowd applauded. But Lena didn't smile. She knew it was just one battle. But it was one. The crowd was slowly dispersing, but Lena Watson was still standing there, watching as Officer Kane's cruiser slowly pulled away from the curb. People were whispering, someone was still filming, but the main thing had already happened. She had seen it many times. When a person who is accustomed to absolute power is faced with the consequences of his actions, the first thing that comes to his mind is denial. He denies his guilt. Denies doing anything wrong. Denies that he is no longer in the lead role. Lena turned her gaze to Cross. Do you think he'll try to get even? He only chuckled slightly. He can try as much as he wants. But we have enough evidence. She knew it was so. The video, dozens of witnesses, his personal file full of complaints. All this meant that Kane could no longer get out of it. But looking at the parting glance he threw her from the window of the police car, Lena realized that he had not yet realized the full gravity of the situation. He still believed that he could get out of this. Later that day, Lena walked into FBI headquarters. The corridors were filled with agents going about their business, but as soon as she crossed the threshold, several people glanced at her. She immediately realized that the news had already spread. This was not just another incident on the street. It was an example of how the system collapses when someone finally refuses to silently submit. Lena entered Cross's office, who was already looking through the documents on his desk. They're waiting for you at the press office, he said without even raising his head. The press service? She frowned. Yes. The Kane story is already in the news. The management wants you to give an official comment. She exhaled quietly. I don't strive for publicity. It's not about you. It's about what happened. Cross finally looked up from his papers and looked her straight in the eye. Today was an important day, Watson. And it must not go unnoticed. Lena knew he was right. When she entered the press center, several cameras were immediately aimed at her. The journalists froze in anticipation, and the FBI press officer, a man in a formal dark suit, nodded to her, inviting her to take a seat at the podium. She never liked public speaking. But today it was necessary. She took a deep breath and spoke. Today we have witnessed a situation that has once again proven how important honesty is in law enforcement. No one should abuse their power. No one should feel above the law. She paused, looking into the camera lens. The law serves the people, not those who consider themselves stronger. Journalists began to bombard her with questions. What are the next steps in the Kane case? Will a police reform be initiated? Do you think this was a random incident or part of a systemic problem? She answered calmly. This was not a random incident. And that is why it is important that it does not go unnoticed. Later that evening, Lena sat in her office, looking at her laptop screen. The video of Kane's arrest had already spread across the internet, and her press conference was gaining views at an incredible rate. There were hundreds of messages in the comments. This is how you should deal with those who abuse their power. She's great. Finally, someone stood up to them. How many more like Kane are going unpunished? She closed the laptop, rubbing her temples. Today was a long day. But something inside told her that this was only the beginning. The system does not change overnight. But sometimes one day is all it takes to start making a change.